Students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today we are looking at all the places the U.S. colonized in the late 1800s. Before you continue the video, make sure that you have a copy of Handout 7.4, something to write with, and about 10 minutes of uninterrupted time to concentrate. On my video, the words that you need to fill in will appear in black. Anything that appears in red is already written down on your handout, which means that you don't have to write it down again. Once again, the only things from the video that you need to fill in on your handout are the words that appear in black. Here we go. Our first colony is Hawaii. Hawaii is a group of islands that are really far from the mainland US. Hawaii is 2,500 miles from California, about a third of the way to Japan, right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Europeans first arrived in Hawaii in the 1700s, and by the late 1800s, a number of American missionaries and businessmen had settled there. Also, the U.S. controlled a naval base at a place in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor. This is Queen Liliuokalani. Try saying that, Liliuokalani. Queen Liliuokalani was a member of a royal family that had ruled Hawaii for hundreds of years. But she would be Hawaii's last queen. And that's because in 1893, a group of mostly foreigners overthrew her and established their own government. The U.S. supported the coup, and 5 years later, the U.S. annexed or took formal control of Hawaii, which became a U.S. territory for the next 60 years. And then, in 1959, Hawaii became a state, and it is still a state today, way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The next colony is Cuba. Cuba is an island in the Caribbean, only about 70 miles away from Florida. Cuba was never technically a colony of the US, but the US had a lot of power over it for a long time. So I am going to include it with the colonies on your handout. You learned earlier about the Cuban War for Independence. That's when Cuba was still a colony of Spain, and José Martí led a movement for independence. Here's a picture of José Martí. He's called the George Washington of Cuba because, like George Washington, he led a movement for independence from a European country. But then in 1898, as Martí was fighting the Spanish and the ruthless General Weyler, the ship, the USS Maine, blew up in Havana Harbor. The newspapers blamed the explosion on Spain, the US declared war, and they fought the Spanish-American War. So after the US won the Spanish-American War, Cuba was technically an independent country, but the Americans forced the Cubans to include something in their constitution called the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment gave the US permission to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever the US decided that that was necessary. So that meant that the power to make Cuba's decisions was really in the hands of the US, not in the hands of the Cubans. And the US got a naval base at a place called Guantanamo Bay, which I'll tell you about in a second. Now fast forward to the 1950s, when a socialist named Fidel Castro led an army of guerrillas in a fight against the US-backed government, and Castro won. Cuba became a communist country and declared itself independent of any US control. In fact, Cuba and the US became enemies. Today, Cuba is still communist and is its own independent country. But the US still controls a little part of Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. And this place is mostly famous for a military prison where, since September 11, 2001, the United States government has been keeping alleged terrorists. So Cuba and the US don't get along, but the US still owns a tiny piece of land in Cuba called Guantanamo Bay, where they have a prison. The next colony is Guam. I'm not going to say too much about Guam, except that it's another small island in the middle of the Pacific, kind of like Hawaii. But unlike Hawaii, Guam is a territory, not a state. The people that live in Guam are U.S. citizens, but they have no representation in Congress and they can't vote in presidential elections. And we call this type of citizenship limited citizenship. That's when citizens are controlled by the U.S. government, but they don't actually have a say in what that government does. Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is another small island that the U.S. took from Spain after the Spanish-American War, and it's in the Caribbean, near Cuba. Puerto Rico is a special political entity called a commonwealth. It's not a state, it's not a territory, it's a commonwealth. The Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans also have limited citizenship, just like the people in Guam. They have no representatives in Congress, and they can't vote for president. Next colony is the Philippines. The Philippines are another group of islands in the Pacific, but they're a lot bigger than Hawaii and Guam. The Philippines had been a Spanish colony, but just like in Cuba, in the late 1800s, there was a war being fought against Spain by independence fighters. And this independence war was called the Philippine Revolution, and it was led by this man, Emilio Aguinaldo. So there are two independence fighters mentioned in this video, Jose Marti in Cuba and Emilio Aguinaldo in the Philippines. And just like in Cuba, when the US went to war with Spain in 1898, Aguinaldo and the independence fighters thought they would finally get their independence, only to discover that they'd really just become a colony of the US. But there's a major difference between the independence movement in Cuba and the one in the Philippines. After the Spanish-American War ended, the independence fighters in the Philippines, unlike those in Cuba, kept fighting for independence. But now they were fighting against the US. And the war that they waged is called the Philippine-American War. A lot more Americans died in this war than in the Spanish-American War, not to mention hundreds of thousands of Filipino civilians. This was a bloody war that went on for 3 years. And the US committed some of the same atrocities that they had accused the Spanish of doing in Cuba, like putting captured rebels in concentration camps. So the US won the war, and the Philippines became a US territory, just like Guam. The US kept control of it until the end of World War II, when the Philippines was granted independence. And the Philippines continues to be an independent country today. The last colony is the Panama Canal Zone. Panama Canal Zone is a strip of land in the country of Panama that was controlled by the US. And Panama is this small country at the bottom of Central America, right where it connects to South America. Besides Hawaii, the Panama Canal Zone is the other colony on your handout that was not taken as a result of the Spanish-American War. Panama had been part of another country called Colombia until 1903, when some people in Panama made a deal with the US. The US would support Panamanian independence from Colombia if the government of the new country of Panama would give the US control of some land to build a canal on. So the US got the land, Panama became independent, and the US built the Panama Canal. And the Panama Canal Zone is this green area, this strip of land on either side of the canal itself. And the US kept control over it as a territory for more or less all of the 1900s. But in 1999, Panama took full control of the canal, and the Canal Zone no longer exists. It's just a part of the independent country of Panama today. Alright, stop and rewind the video if you missed anything. Make sure your handout is complete. Tune in next time for another screencast, and I will see you in class. Bye, students.